For two reasons. The first one is that it is the role of the finance ministers to stick to the wording and to the statements of the head of states. There has been a very clear condemnation of the decision of Russia to attack Ukraine during the G20 in Bali. We should stick, and we must stick, to this statement. And the second reason why I strongly oppose any water down of this statement is that things are not moving on the right direction. We have losses in Ukraine. We have destructions in Ukraine. Many countries are facing the very deep and strong consequences of the war in Ukraine on their growth, on inflation. So it is not time to water down the communique. It's time to stick to the very strong wording.
Sir,
because sometimes it's useful to be very vocal and to make very clear what you can accept and what you cannot accept. France, and I think all European countries, cannot accept any water down of the G20 communique of Bali.
You speak for Europe?
I think that all the European countries could share my point of view, and they express exactly the same point of view during the G20 meeting.
We had the G7 roundtable, nations roundtable yesterday, where I think additional sanctions were discussed. What areas would you be targeting with new sanctions?
Well, we are in the process of defining these new sanctions. For the time being, I just want to insist on the fact that sanctions that have been already implemented and decided are very efficient. When you are looking at the figures, looking at the oil revenues that has been diminishing in Russia thanks to the sanctions, when you are looking at the assets that have been frozen, more than $58 billion, you can say that sanctions against Russia are efficient.
But the WTO came out with a report highlighting that Russia's exports in value terms have actually increased over the last 12 months. Even the volume has declined, and especially in agri-commodities and commodities in general.
When you are looking at the oil revenues have been divided by two because of the sanctions. And I think that we must stick to a very clear, strong implementation of the sanctions. Sanctions will be more and more efficient on the long term. So we need to be quite confident, we need to be firm, we need to be strong. That's exactly the attitude that has been chosen by all European members. And I would like to insist also on the fact that all European countries stand united facing this war in Ukraine and facing the decisions of sanctions. This is quite good news for Europe.
Right. Does that mean that all of you are in agreement for more financial aid going out to Ukraine, in addition to what the IMF is firming up in terms of a relief package?
Yes, we have already decided a package of 18 billion euros at the
Can that
European
number go
level.
up?
Then the IMF just decided, under the pressure of all European countries, a new package of $15.5 billion that should be delivered by March 2023. If there is any necessity to provide more financial help, President Macron made very clear when we organized this conference on Ukraine last month that we stand ready to provide all necessary financial support to Ukraine.
Right. I also want to talk about the economy back home in France. Obviously the focus right now is on the energy crisis. The focus is also on growth and prosperity and investments. I think the big issue out there is dealing with transatlantic issues, especially that got triggered by the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act. You made a trip to the U.S. earlier in the month. Could we expect Europe's version or France's version of the IRA as well?
I think that you can expect the European version of the Inflation Reduction Act. The US administration decided this Inflation Reduction Act with the view of accelerating the building of a very strong green industry. We want to do exactly the same in Europe. We want to be part...
So tit for tat?
It is not tit for tat. It is just fair competition, and it must be a fair competition based on full transparency on the level of subsidies and on the level of credit tax. That's exactly what we explained with my German counterpart, Robert Habeck, to the US administration. It must be fair competition. So that
Did they understand, sir?
I think they understand that fair competition is in the interest of everybody, because it will avoid a subsidy race that would be a negative for both the US and Europe. But as far as Europe is concerned, we are totally determined to build a strong green industry and to provide all the necessary financial means, either public or private, to finance hydrogen, green hydrogen, chips, semiconductors, solar panels, and all the necessary tools for the green industry.
When does the Act come into force? I mean, when will you be able to put a framework in place?
There has been the first proposal made by the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. We are in the process of examining and implementing those decisions. I hope that by the end of 2023 we will have all the necessary tools to accelerate the building of this green industry. And all European industry, all European member states must be aware of the necessity to accelerate in the building of this green industry.
I also want to talk about pension reforms back home in France. There's been much opposition, and polls are suggesting that the people of France are not with you on these pension reforms. Would you still push ahead?
Yes, because it is a necessity for our pension system. You know, I'm very much attached to the idea of having a solidarity between the young and the older generations. But if you want to have solidarity, you need to finance your solidarity. And the reform that we have been presenting with President Macron, that we have been improving by providing concessions, new solutions, and some improvements of the reform, all those decisions are necessary to have the financial balance of the global system by 2030.
So how would you implement these pension reforms? Would you take time? Would you convince people? Or would you just go ahead through Parliament and get the vote on the floor of the Parliament? Or perhaps even circumvent Parliament vote?
We already took time, many time, to explain the reform. We took time to improve the reform. You know that at the beginning of the reform, the age of retirement that was proposed by President Macron was 65. We listened to the critics, we listened to the proposals, and we moved from the 65 to 64. So this is the very clear evidence that we stand ready to improve our reform, but at the end of the legislative process, there is a need for a reform. It's a question of responsibility.
So would it take a Parliament vote or not? I mean, are you willing to circumvent that process?
I'm confident that we will have the majority at the French Parliament to vote this reform.
My final question, sir, because you're at the G20 and I know that you're racing against time, but just final question. President Macron is going to be visiting China in April. And so I want to understand that how are you going to reconcile? Because obviously you've said in the past during Davos that, you know, China must be in, must not be out. But how do you reconcile that difference, given the stand that the US is taking against China?
But you know, we are independent countries. We are close allies to the US, all European countries, but we are also an independent continent. And we also want to build a fair relationship with China. You cannot have China out. This is an illusion. You must have China in, which means discussing with China, improving the difficulties that we are sometimes facing, fixing some issues, but continuing the discussion with China. That's exactly what
Are you okay with China's closeness with Russia?
But you know, on many topics, we might have some differences of views. Is it a reason why we should stop the discussion with China? Certainly not. Once again, we don't want to oppose China, we want to engage China.
Hi, I'm Joanna Bersecci and thank you for watching. You can check out more of our videos by clicking on the boxes on the screen. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more from CNBC International. Thank you for watching.